Hi, everybody. Hello, hello. So, Molly Crabapple, it's a real pleasure to be here with you. And although Alan already divulged a lot of Molly's life yesterday, I wanted to just share something. There are many things written about you, Molly, as you know.
Many of them bad.
Mostly good, but clearly a person who defies easy definition. But there was one that I liked. In fact, here's another journalist quoting other journalists, which is what I'm doing too. But it's well done, I thought. Magazines describe her as a punk Joan Didion. You probably hate these descriptions. A young Patti Smith with paint on her hands, a 21st century Sylvia Plath, it goes on, art's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the millennial generation's first great radical artist. Finally, she is, as Deb Olin Unworth wrote for the New York Times, a lion for her own cause, ferocious and feminist, hardworking and weepy. A new waddle, weepy, yeah. I guess you cried in the interview?
She didn't interview me. I don't know where she got that from.
A new model for this century's young woman. So you weep in your memoir. You describe crying.
I do.
And maybe that's where she picked it up.
Maybe.
She just asserted that you wept anyway. But one thing I noticed in your memoir, in your book, Drawing Blood, is that you write without any filter. Molly has the unique ability to write as she speaks, which is something a lot of writers struggle hard to do. It's the first lesson you're told when you say to your parents or a writing teacher that you want to be a writer. And they say, just write like you talk. And it's very hard to do, but Molly does. And there are passages in there that just, they're mellifluous, and you share your life in a pretty unexpurgated way that's unique and refreshing, I think.
Thank you.
So maybe that's where she was coming from with that. But we've met a couple of times over the years. I first met Molly in India, where we had both been invited to a thing called the Jaipur Festival. And I don't know if you noticed, but we were staying, it was pretty incongruous, Molly being, kind of anarcho-punk or something. And I saw her in the restaurant of this palace hotel that they have there. And do you know who else was in the room when we were there?
Who else was in the room?
Princess Diana's brother, lurching around, yeah. I say lurching because I think he was drunk at 10 in the morning. But anyway, it was a pretty incongruous setting to meet Molly Crabapple, but I admired her work. We stayed in touch, and later I visited you at your apartment in the Lower East Side, which I always think of as like something out of I wasn't a Batman comic reader when I was a kid, but in the sense that Gotham,
Exactly.
It reminded me of like something out of that. The area, not that far from Wall Street. Again, an incongruous place for Molly Crabapple to live, unless you knew that she was an integral part of Occupy Wall Street, that long forgotten protest movement that predated so many others in this world that now seems to be tumbling in the opposite direction.
Exactly.
So I guess, Molly, you grew up in New York, you're a native New Yorker, you still live in New York now, in New York City, you're no longer in Wall Street, you're somewhere else that sounds very cool, and I want you to tell us about it if you want to. But I also wanted to ask you what it is that's defined your life. Reading your books, seeing your work, it's clear to me that you've always been drawn to communities, very often communities in resistance in one fashion or another. You're on the left, but you defy easy definition by conventional standards of the left. And by that I mean, for instance, you ended up writing a book with Marwan Hisham about the Syrian civil war at a time when I recall many friends of mine on the, let's say, the outer reaches of the left were still playing violin concertos for Hafiz al-Assad, or rather his son, Bashar al-Assad. Yeah. So you defy, I go back to what I said at the beginning, you defy easy definition. And so maybe let's begin there. What is it in your life? What is it as you have evolved that's drawn you to these communities? And by the way, they all have names. There are places that are geographical. And there's, Axarquia, there's the box, there's the Lower East Side. What was the original name for it?
Well, the Puerto Rican name for the Lower East Side was Loisaida, because that's how if you speak Spanish and you mispronounce the Lower East Side, you do it like that.
Which is, it's very beautiful, yeah. And now the community is?
Well, I live in South Williamsburg, so I live in a part of Brooklyn that is half Hasidic Jewish and half Puerto Rican. So half extremely, extremely religious Orthodox Jewish with everything according to very rigorous religious laws, and half working class Puerto Ricans that are playing Bad Bunny from their cars and having salsa parties. It's fucking awesome. I'm half Jewish and half Puerto Rican myself. I feel very at home there in multiple ways. So I've been drawing since I was 4 years old. I cannot imagine a life without drawing. As soon as my hand worked, it was holding a pen. For me, the way that I interact with the world is that I draw. I don't know if anyone here was at the talk that I was part of yesterday, but if you were at while I was on the panel, I was drawing the people around me. And when I was young, it was always hard for me to talk to people. I don't know, I was one of these like dorky little kids hiding in the corner. And I was like looking at these fascinating, beautiful people that I couldn't sort of bridge the gap with. And so the way that I bridged that gap has always been that I drew pictures. Whether it was drawing a picture of a girl that I was absolutely crushing on when I was 12 years old, whether it was drawing pictures of the circus performers and the burlesque dancers and the contortionists at nightclubs and being part of that community and earning my place in that community with my pen, like Toulouse-Lautrec did. We're the same height, by the way. Or whether it was drawing protest movements and drawing places in extremis, like Greek refugee camps or Gaza. My sketchbook was always my lockpick to the larger world. It was always the way that I sought connection, and it was always a way that I made community as well. Now, when I got my start as an artist, I did not get my start as a journalist. I did not go to J school. I did not go to a university. I went to a terrible school called the Fashion Institute of Technology, and I dropped out because I had to work, and it sucked. And I got my start as a working artist drawing nightclubs. Specifically, there was a nightclub in New York City that was called The Box. Now, The Box was the sort of place that the very worst people in the world, the people who have wrecked global economies and bankrupt small countries, go to spend $10,000 of their ill-gotten gains on bottles of champagne and then try to pick up naked dancers. That is the sort of place The Box is. And I became their house artist when I was 24. Now, this place, while filled with repellent people in the audience, had one saving grace, which was that the dictator of the place was self-aware. And he allowed me to do whatever I wanted with my artwork. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to draw his customers as pigs snorting cocaine. And I wanted to draw my friends who were performers there as gods and goddesses. And that was, when you talk about place, right? Like that place was my first muse. It was class warfare in the form of a nightclub. It was a place where people who were very, very different from each other, but who wanted something from each other, were rubbing up against each other and like, you know, with like all the desire and hatred that implies, right? That was my muse. My second great muse, I suppose, was when I was, how old was I? I'm gonna have to count. When I was 28, there was a protest movement called Occupy Wall Street that I don't know how many people here know about it. It was some time ago. It was a movement against financial corruption and just the oligarchic capitalist devastation of the American economy that was manifesting in taking away people's houses and in horrific banks that were sucking us all dry. It was a protest movement that was started with encampments in squares, and it was very much part of these leaderless, networked, internet-enabled movements of 2011 that stretched from, Tahrir Square to Greece to Tunisia, and all of which were eventually crushed. I lived across the street from Zuccotti Park, where the encampment was, and every day I would go down and I would draw it. Before that, I'm just drawing at nightclubs, right? And I grew up, my dad's a Marxist. My dad is a Puerto Rican nationalist Marxist, and I grew up thinking, I grew up to see the people that I was working for as rather contemptible creatures, to be honest. And so I started feeling like I was painting pigs in Nero's nightclub, I started feeling like I had eaten too much candy with my art and that what I was doing was not real. And I wanted to take my work from just drawing hot girls in stockings to drawing the conflicts that were on the streets of my city and that were on the streets of cities around the world. And Occupy Wall Street was where I got permission to do that. From Occupy, I ended up traveling around the world to document scenes of conflict, of protest, of repression. I went to Gaza in 2015. I snuck into refugee camps in Greece and also hung out with the anarchists in Exarchia in Athens, who were helping refugees better than any goddamn NGO ever was. I traveled to Puerto Rico, where my dad is from, after a hurricane decimated the island and both local and federal governments left people without electricity or water for a year. I went to the US-Mexican border during the time when the Trump administration was separating moms from their kids. And through all of those places, I was using my sketchbook and also my writing, not just to tell, sad stories, right? Because I don't think sadness, pity creates empathy. I think it actually, maybe at first people feel bad, but then they become indifferent and they just, feel like, oh, these people are just fucking doomed, right? Instead, I tried to tell the stories of smart people who were fighting in defiance of the roles that the world had inflicted on them. One place I went to Abu Dhabi, which, if anyone's ever been there, it's a society where, there's this extreme stratification based on citizenship, where if you're a working class South Asian guy, you are treated like an indentured servant. You're treated like an animal, right? And I ended up writing about a young man who was a young South Asian man who was one of the most brilliant people I ever met. But no one in that society could see it because he's a working class South Asian guy. And he was tipping off all of the international journalists and NGOs about all of the labor abuses. And no one could figure it out because he just told his boss he was playing Candy Crush. And the boss was like, yeah, that seems more logical than that this guy is fucking brilliant and brave. And I think the other thing that I've always been drawn to is I've been drawn to communities of resistance. One of the places that I've most admired that I've been to is a squat that used to exist in Athens called City Plaza. This was a place where there had been a hotel. It had went bankrupt, owing lots of money to its workers. And so the workers took some bolt cutters and they gave the hotel over to refugee activists. And these activists turned it into a squat for families so instead of living in a miserable camp, you had a hotel room. But it was not a charitable endeavor. It was an endeavor of solidarity. And the difference of that is that it was something that was organized with the refugees in collaboration. The kitchen was run by like ladies who really fucking knew how to cook Afghan food. The people who were administering it, some of them were like my friend Nassim, who's an Afghan dude who came over in 2003, learned Greek in jail, and then became like one of the most hard-ass activists I ever met. And it was run on the principle of people from poor countries, and Greece at that time was a poor country, living together, no matter what their trauma was, no matter what borders were, no matter what their citizenship was, just finding a way to like live together and to build a world together. So that's what I've always been attracted to.
I realized that art and action could infuse one another. A painting didn't have to hang in a gallery dead as a pinned butterfly. Art could be gorgeous, engaged, and political, working defiant magic on the world. What impels you to these communities of resistance?
I guess I think we're always, anything that we are really attracted to, it's always a mixture of hatred and love, right? So on one hand, I love these people. I love people building worlds in defiance of how the world is supposed to be. I love people who plant flowers in the filthy, toxic earth of New York City, right? But on the other hand, I have a hatred, too, that compels me, which is that there is a way that certain types of capitalism want to make the world where it is totally mediated, where corporations lie in between our most intimate interactions, even between our friendships, right? Even between ourselves and our own creativity. They want to create cities that look like iPhone packaging. They're so white and sleek and sterile. They want to have people that don't have relationships with those around them, but rather interface with the world through their iPhones, ordering invisible servants to deliver them food and take their laundry. And I hate that. I hate the control that's behind that. I hate the coercive violence that's always hiding. And I just also think it's so dull. I think it's such a waste of life. And so I think part of why I'm drawn to these communities is that they're like the last strongholds against that, right?
Also, it's interesting that your art, you mentioned Lautrec and others, the late 19th century artists at time of, especially in places like New York and for that matter Europe, anarchistic and revolutionary ferment, right? This is when the world was changing rapidly because of the Industrial Revolution and led to a lot of the utopias and dystopias that we lived through in the 20th century. But your art is so influenced by that in some ways. There's a kind of yesteryear quality to your portraits, like the one you've put up here, which has an elegance and a kind of a beauty that feels out of time sometimes, and yet can be very contemporary. But one of the things, and we were talking about this earlier, is that what's interesting about that art was expunged by the technologies that came to define the 20th century, right? Different sort of lines, but also photography, the age of film and cinema, right? Television. And now we have, of course, the internet and a new televisual revolution and AI. And so it's interesting that from the sort of wellspring of some of your artistic inspiration was expunged in an earlier technological revolution. And now we have the AI revolution coming. Will that displace? You sort of are alluding to it in what you just spoke about. The world as an iPhone, I remember that first time I was shown one of those Musk cars, what are they called?
The Teslas?
I was called, they said it's an iPhone with wheels.
Oh, right? For fuck's sake.
Yeah, I know, by someone who bought one. So the world's changing not just politically, but artistically too. What you do can be replicated by robots or machines or whatever we call AI. What's your take on that?
I have a lot of takes on that. First off, pretty much every single illustrator in the world who has any sense in their brain, I detest AI art generators. I detest them. And I first became aware of these when there was this data set. It's called the Lion 5B data set, which is basically billions of images, 5 billion images that are scraped from the internet. I became aware of how AI was gobbling up my own work when I saw that my own work was on this data set that was used to train Stable Diffusion and Midjourney. And when people were showing me that you could type in Syrian street drawn by Molly Crabapple and get a cliched bad facsimile of my work, like maybe what I would do if I was really drunk and soulless, you know? But I detest these generators because they represent the end state of enclosure, right? So first, like capitalism, it encloses, the land, encloses people. But then what it does is it encloses our entire collective human culture, everything we've ever created, right? All of that art, all of that music, pictures of your kids, right? Your medical photos, everything, every image. It takes all of that, gobbles it up, makes it into a product that $1 billion corporation sells back to you. They take what is human, what is collective, what is organic, what is soulful. They strip it, and then they turn it into a bullshit slurry to sell back to us. And they do it not just at the cost of jobs and not just at the cost of culture, but also at the cost of destroying our planet and physical world. Generative AI uses huge, huge amounts of electricity and water. It uses cobalt in the batteries. It uses rare earth. It literally represents taking our planet that we live on, our fragile, much hurting planet, and feeding it into a giant furnace so that nerds can make anime girls with big tits. And also so that people do not have to, or the companies do not have to pay for illustrations for advertisements. That is what it's for. Now, do I think it will replace me? I hope not. I think I'm pretty established right now. But do I think it would have replaced me if I was 19 years old and I was starting? Yes, I do. I think what AI is going to do for the illustration world is it's going to destroy all of the gigs that people do when they're starting out. There's always going to be a high end, right? There's always going to be, a few fancy places that will want stuff that looks different and that looks human. But those places will be reserved for people who have already made it. And everyone who's young, they require time to find their voice. They require, just the gigs that you do so that you can learn what it's like to actually be a professional. And if those gigs are all done by AI, then no one ever gets to make it as an artist unless they already have a trust fund that's paying their bills, or they've already married a rich guy, or unless they're already dealing drugs. That's that.
Or, as has already happened, Russian, and not only Russian, oligarchs acquire a taste for Basquiat.
God.
Right? Art becomes the purview, the most valued, the most artificially valued, and the most valued commodity on earth.
Absolutely. That's always been something I've thought a lot about. Like, I'm in the art world. I've never been someone who sold a painting for $1 million, God willing. But I'm not that. But the thing that makes visual art different than other things is if I'm a writer, like our success is that we sell millions of copies of books as a writer. Whereas for a fine artist, what defines success is that less and less and worse people can afford your work. It's not that you sell 1 million copies of something to the masses, right? It's that one Russian oligarch or one Elon Musk can afford your $20 bajillion crumpled up tinfoil with an artist statement.
In light of this, in light of the threat from AI and what's happening, and the extreme power of the kind of new plutocrats of big tech, where and in your own sort of twin existence of art and activism and writing. So wherein lies the new tension for you? You draw, you paint, you make art, plastic art, you write, and you speak. You have a performative ability. Do you have to do all three now? And
Yeah.
if the world was different, would you have to, or would you want to, or is this just part of who you are?
I don't know. I mean, I like to talk to people. I would always draw pictures. I would always write. I mean, I hate writing. It's a torment. I really don't like it. But for some reason, I feel compelled to. It's like cutting yourself or something. But I think I would still do it. I mean, but it's true. It's like what you have to do now to make it. It's like you have to work harder and harder and harder and market more of yourself and constantly be feeding yourself into these websites that have algorithms that make you jump like Pavlov's dog, that make you, shift what you do. I mean, we all remember when Facebook had the websites pivot to video, and then it was all based on a lie, and those websites had laid off a lot of journalists. I increasingly detest the requirement to be on my phone, the requirement to post on social media, the requirement to be constantly present in that way. And yet, as someone who's an independent artist, I don't know any way to get out of that. And I think that's the tension. Like, we're feeding so much of our life into these machines that are just meant to spy on us and sell us shit. And yet I don't know how to get out of it.
Yeah. In a conversation we were having, I was asking you about this need I've been feeling to be physically present with people, that just writing, just journalism as I've performed it, maybe isn't enough anymore. If you have a president of the United States calling us out as enemies of the people, that's an extreme act of hostility. That's a statement coming from a person of extreme power who's not just describing you as an adversary, he's actively trying to expunge you. And so I've had this instinct ever since the unmentionable cretin with orange hair came on the scene, that we need to be somehow militant. And I use the word advisedly. We were talking about this, and I've often thought of you because you are the most, and it's a bit of an out of time word. And if you're in Spanish, it means like subversive, could even mean terrorist. It's a dangerous word to use, and people can misconstrue it. But what I mean by that is we have to defend our right to exist. So we also have to be, and we're not objective, we try to be fair, we try to be honest, we try to convince people that we're worth reading or watching or listening to, because at least we're sincere. We've done the best we can. But if we lose that ability to convince people of that, we're gone. The new fascists, the Orbans, the Trumps, the Putins, will win, and we'll be the dodo. And in talking to you about that, I was expressing frustration that young people, Gen X's or whatever they're called, spend all their time on iPhones deciding whether they want lavender chai latte or a skinny chai latte or pumpkin spice chai latte, and don't actually get out and protest anymore, which was a cynical statement to make. And you reminded me that, in fact, they have been.
All the time.
All the time. And I had completely forgotten about the George Floyd protests, because we were talking about the campus protests in the States and Gaza now. And you reminded me, and I had forgotten, believe it or not, about that momentarily. And I said, well, how could I have forgotten? And you said, because we have a sense that we're losing. So what's that about?
Why are we losing?
Why are we losing? And you made the remark, going back to what you just said about social media, that, and I was insisting on the public space, like the guy over here who may or may not be paid for by the Kremlin, rabble-rousing every afternoon. But we need to get in people's faces. We need to talk to the people who believe in conspiracy theories and call us the deep state or whatever. And you were saying, actually, the place to probably do that is on TikTok.
It's one of them, yeah.
So I don't know. Just finish the thought for me. Why are we losing? And really, does it have to be on TikTok?
It doesn't just have to be on TikTok. It's merely one place. I mean, I've just said how we're all hypnotized by our phones, right? If you want to talk to people who are hypnotized by their phones, that's one way. I think that we're at this paradoxical time where both young people, and not just like young people on like Ivy League campuses, who are a very small percentage of the people in the world and get disproportionate amount of attention, frankly. Not just them, but young people in general, I think are politicized and are militant. Like I'm so inspired by this successful union drive of the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, led by Chris Smalls, right? I think that I've never seen the left in New York so integrated into young people's lives, and even in the sense of like defending someone from an eviction, right? Or joining a picket line. So I think that young people are doing things. I just think we're also losing. And I think that that's the paradox. Like, that's the thing that's heartbreaking. It's not like we're just sitting here and twiddling our thumbs. No, it's that people are doing a lot and they're also being crushed. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. I love this book by Vincent Bevins that's called If We Burn, which is an analysis of the 2011 uprisings that, they defined my life. And it talks about how leaderless and spontaneous movements, while they feel so good and while they're like love, are doomed also, because they inevitably get co-opted, get crushed, people fade away from them, they have to go back to their lives. And they don't have the sort of deep organization that other older forms had, whether those were trade unions, whether those were things like the civil rights movement, whether those were political parties. So I believe that if we want to win, we have to meet people where they are, and that could be TikTok or it could be at their workplace, right? And you have to speak to them in a language that's their language. I think one thing the left is really good at is using a bunch of alienating jargon that no one likes and long acronyms. They seem to think that the longer the acronym, the more justice is achieved. If just add another letter, you've included someone. I think that you need to speak to people where they are, how they talk about things that matter to them, because I genuinely do believe that everyone wants like decent housing. Everyone wants a job that doesn't humiliate them, that pays them enough to live. Everyone wants, enough free time to be with their friends and family. Like, these are leftist values. And if we're failing, it's in part because we failed to communicate that.
I was having a conversation with a friend the other day about Vincent's book and this idea of leaderless revolutions, the soft revolutions where you stand in a plaza and shout, and eventually the dictator leaves and is replaced by somebody else, just as repressive. Sisi replacing Mubarak ultimately in Egypt, etc. You can go down the list. And it's interesting because since the 2010s, maybe since the smartphone, there is this conceit. There was a conceit, I don't know if it still exists, amongst, again, a new generation, that a revolution could be a thing where you didn't actually expunge the old order. They went home. They behaved in a civil way. You could shout at them, shame them. They would go home, and you would, or the people you thought should be, and more democratically minded people, less corrupt people, would assume their rightful place in this democratic firmament. Hasn't worked out like that. And it reminds me, too, that we're in a very different place than we were in the mid-20th century, when revolutions involved taking up guns and killing people. Che Guevara famously was in Guatemala when a CIA-backed paramilitary force ousted a left of center. Left of center wasn't very radical, actually. They espoused land reform regime. And for several months, he and other young students there begged the regime to give them guns so they could help defend it. That president refused. He was sent off in pajamas, and Guatemala went into a half century of repression and terror, which it's only now coming out of, maybe. Che Guevara, having gone through that experience, having witnessed the futility of a revolution, which is what the Guatemalan experience was calling itself, without getting rid of the old order, that is, killing the military guys who would ultimately betray you, went on to help lead the Cuban Revolution just 3 or 4 years later. And what he insisted upon, and the role he played in the first, both in the mountains and then when they arrived in Havana, were the revolutionary summary trials of the old order, in which about 300 people were executed by firing squad in public with the press invited. It didn't do wonders for their PR image, but it secured the revolution its place in power on that island, which, and I know that one could easily say, well, look how it ended up. But if it's power that you want, maybe, skinny chai latte isn't the way to go.
See, I think the skinny chai latte thing is a little bit unfair. I think that's a little bit of a cliche. I would say that the problem isn't the skinny chai latte. The problem is that there's a discomfort with power. I think that for very good reasons, extremely good and moral reasons, people are uncomfortable with the idea of power, and what they're actually seeking is something that's not just to raise themselves to power, and but to make something where power is equalized, where people do not have repressive power over each other. And I think that the reason that they're seeking at that is that they've seen everything that's happened in all of the revolutions of the 20th century, which is, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? If what they're seeking is possible, whether that's possible is an open question. But I think that that's where it comes from. It doesn't come from people being, soft chai latte drinking iPhone addicts. It comes from people not wanting to repeat the revolutionary atrocities that have, come throughout the 20th century. You think you don't agree? You don't agree?
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, plenty of people are willing to commit atrocities. Look at ISIS.
But they're not chai latte drinkers.
No, they're not. That's true.
Or revolutionaries of the square.
So as not to get off
Yeah.
in my own twisted little area of bloody revolution. What I think, and this is what we talked about, where does this work? It goes back to your communities and communities of resistance. Where does it work? Where you have true communal reform, where you have even idealistic seeming pleasant communities that work together, revolutionary or not, is in small groups. Isn't that right?
Where people know each other, and where it's not someone who's over here who doesn't know anything about over here imposing what they want on, over here. I am
The neighborhood where you live.
the neighborhood where I live, which has many flaws, many flaws, but I'm just going to tell a story about a type of housing structure in New York that, is small, is incredibly inadequate for our housing needs in New York, but it's something amazing as well. So in the 1970s, New York City was broke, and it was actually better for business as a landlord to burn down your building than to collect rents in it. Because if you burn down your building, you could get insurance money. And I do not mean burn down your empty building. I mean burn down your building where people lived in it. And there was a systematic disinvestment of Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods where fire departments were closed by the city in those neighborhoods because those neighborhoods were seen as not worthy of existence. And there were fires, a lot of fires, especially in the Bronx. If you look at photos of the Bronx at that time, it looks like a war zone. You wouldn't believe that this was a city at peace. There's so much rubble, right? And there was a movement that was led by Black and Puerto Rican mothers in these buildings And remember, these buildings are falling apart, right? Like they have holes in the roof, there's no windows. Like these are not, beautiful buildings. I think they're beautiful, but they're not in good condition. But they're people's homes. And so these women worked with community organizations, many of which were founded by radicals, to take the buildings back from the landlords and to say, no, you're not going to burn us out of here. And also, no, New York City, you're not going to kick us out and tear down our building and give it to some rich guy to build a mall. And no, this is our home and it belongs to us because we live here. It's ours, right? And the building that I live in was one of those buildings. It was a Puerto Rican building, very working class people. It had no glass in the windows. The water was turned off. People had to go to the fire hydrant downstairs and fill buckets of water to flush the toilet, right? It was a place where when they were at real war with the landlord, he sabotaged the stairs and people had to go up the fire escapes on the outside of the building. And these people in this building fought for 10 years and they got their apartments sold to them for almost no money on the deal that they could also only sell their apartments cheap. And there are many flaws, there are many problems with this model of housing. I'm not, a lot of rich kids who make low salaries get in on it. I'm not saying it's perfect. But what it did was it enabled there to be buildings that were long-lasting communities of poor and working class people, where their kids stayed in there, where they did not have to pay 60% of their salary in rent, where they got to stay, where they got to live and make the neighborhood theirs. And, I know the people in my building, they're not all saints. There's some real yahoos. I love them all, but they did this together. They did this. They took the city back. They took the city as something that they had a right to. And those are the things that inspire me. And I don't think it can only be done on small scale. And also, when you work on small scale, you can always be crushed by a significantly powerful bastard. But they work nonetheless. And even if it's not utopia, it's something worth fighting for.
We're going to go to questions in a second. But before we do, the note you just ended on, which we're talking about grassroots activism, really, right? Where it can work at the community level, leads me to ask you a question about your new project, which is about the Bund, and you're the great-grandfather who inspired this project. Tell us a bit about that, if you can, because, again, it was in a different era, and it was a different form of grassroots movement, but it's largely been expunged from history. And so tell us a little bit about that and maybe why that's happened, and then we'll go to questions. Thanks.
I'll start out talking about my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a painter. He's Jewish from Belarus, who came to America in 1904. And I grew up surrounded by his artwork. I never met him. He died before I was born, but I feel like I know him. I read all his writings. He was like a dad to my mother. He taught my mother how to paint. That's why I know how to paint. And one of the things that he did was during the 1930s, after Kristallnacht and through the 40s, he did a series of 600 watercolors that were his memories of his hometown in Belarus. And these watercolors showed every aspect of life, from himself spying on the woman's bathhouse as a little boy, to Tsarist soldiers beating people, to studying religious texts, to this one picture that I was obsessed with growing up. And it's this picture of a young woman, and she's wearing a long skirt and her little waist with a corset, and her hair is, like an updo from the turn of the century. And she's throwing a rock through a window. And next to her is her boyfriend, and her boyfriend has a bag of rocks, because she shouldn't have to carry your own rocks. And it was titled Itka the Bundist Breaking Windows. And I was like, Bundist? What's that? And that question led me on this hunt to find out about a political party that my great-grandfather was involved with, that was born in the Tsarist Empire in 1897, that was Jewish, secular, socialist, and anti-Zionist. And it was anti-Zionist because it said that Jews have the right to live in Europe. Jews had lived in Eastern Europe for 1,000 years. The idea that they have to go somewhere else, fuck that. This is their country. Where they live is their country, and they would fight for it. And this political party, the Jewish Labor Bund, was interwoven in almost every event of the history of Eastern Europe, from the Russian Revolution to interwar Poland, where they became the most popular Jewish political party, to helping lead the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And they did it through a combination of grassroots community activism, like defending people from evictions, right? Setting up a school system for working class kids, telling working class women about birth control, right? Setting up summer camps, youth movements, choruses, athletic leagues, all of these things on one hand. On the other hand, by building a capacious intellectual world with newspapers that told just like Warsaw Tailors about what was happening in China, right? That with publishing houses, with school systems that educated people who had worked in sweatshops from the age of 10, to, and there's not three hands, I know that, but third hand, to militant self-defense. Interwar Poland and previously the Tsarist Empire were incredibly anti-Semitic places. These were places that wanted to expel their Jewish population, especially interwar Poland. Interwar Poland literally suggested colonizing Madagascar to ship Jews there. And so when the Bund says, here where I live is my country, that's a defiant statement. That's not like me saying that about New York, that's saying, fuck you, here where I live is my country, and I will fight for it. And as I researched this party, I wrote an essay on it for the New York Review of Books in 2018, which was the most viral essay that I had ever written in my life. I've never had anything that approached that. And many people contacted me, but one group that meant a lot to me were people in their 80s and 90s whose parents and grandparents were leaders of the movement. And they thanked me because they felt that the movement had been erased. And it had not just been erased because it was murdered by the Nazis or because it was murdered by Stalin. It was also erased because it was anti-Zionist. And the ideology of Zionism, the ideology of Israel says, no, Jews can't live in Europe. They can't. You need an ethno-state to protect you. And that Jews who lived in Europe, Jews who died in the Holocaust, they died because they were weak, because they didn't fight back. And we are strong. And the reason that the Bund was so hated by Zionism, and is still something that's pretty detested by Israel, was not just because they were anti-Zionist, it was also because they were strong. And it was a defiance of that logic. And so I was so touched by these elderly people, and I was so moved by what I had learned in my research that I learned Yiddish, and I got a book deal, and I just finished a first draft about it's the first popular book about the Jewish Labor Bund and my great-grandfather.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Molly. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you.
Viva la revolución.